What started the Great LA Fire? January 2025, on 7th of Sunday, 10:30 a.m. A quiet hillside on the edge of Los Angeles. Dry grass covers the ground, untouched for months. The air is warm, still, waiting. Then, out of nowhere, a single ember drifts down from the sky. By afternoon, flames tore through canyons, creeping toward multi-million-dollar homes. Then, at 6:18 p.m., another fire erupted near Eaton Canyon, miles away. By nightfall, entire streets were burning. The flames were racing and devouring neighborhoods in minutes. Just like that, Los Angeles was living in a nightmare. Now that it's over, the question is, how did this fire actually start? And why weren't firefighters able to stop it? The first flames of the Eaton fire sparked just outside of Pasadena, in a canyon filled with dry brush, hiking trails, and one very specific high-risk danger: power lines.
Southern California Edison says it found no problems.
Southern California Edison, the same utility company previously blamed for multiple deadly fires, owned the lines that stretched across those canyons. And on the morning of January 7th, Los Angeles was under an extreme wind warning. Gusts reached 70 miles per hour, just strong enough to do something very dangerous. First, the power line swayed, whipping back and forth in the wind. Then, just for a second, two lines touched. There was a bright flash, a tiny explosion of light in the sky, and then fire. The first flames started instantly, ripping through the canyon as if the land had been waiting to burn. Dry brush, dead trees, brittle grass. It all went up like gasoline. But what made it worse? Edison had the power to shut off the lines before this happened. They didn't. Just days earlier, the National Weather Service had issued a red flag warning, one of the highest wildfire risk alerts possible. It meant that winds, dry conditions, and heat were all aligning for the perfect storm. Other power companies in California had already preemptively shut off electricity in high-risk areas, a move designed to prevent sparks like this one. But in LA, nothing. So when that tiny arc of electricity ignited the brush, the flames didn't hesitate. The fire was already ahead of the people trying to stop it. Firefighters arrived within 10 minutes, and it was already too big. By the time backup came, the flames were moving twice as fast as they should have been. The first homes caught fire less than an hour after ignition. And Eaton Canyon wasn't the only place burning, because on the other side of Los Angeles, a second fire was waking up. Just before noon, thick smoke began pouring out of a remote section of Pacific Palisades, a neighborhood famous for two things: its multi-million-dollar homes perched along the cliffs, and its narrow winding canyons filled with dead vegetation waiting for a spark. And a spark is exactly what it got. When fire investigators reached the origin point of the Palisades fire, they found something shocking. Spent fireworks. Someone, and to this day we still don't know who, had set off illegal fireworks on New Year's Eve just days before. At first, nothing happened. The fireworks burned out, buried themselves in the dirt. But that's the thing about embers. They don't go out. They can stay alive for days, hidden beneath dry leaves, just waiting for the right moment. And on January 7th, the wind arrived. It only took a single gust to lift the embers back into the air. And the second they touched dry brush, the Palisades fire was born. It exploded so fast, even firefighters weren't sure what happened. The flames raced uphill, consuming everything in their path. Smoke swallowed the Pacific Coast Highway. Entire neighborhoods vanished within an hour. Now, Los Angeles had two separate wildfires tearing in opposite directions. One started by negligence, another started by stupidity. And both were now too big to stop. But it didn't take long for the blame game to start. Some residents swore they saw something else ignite the fire. Maybe a homeless encampment, maybe even arsonists. Others pointed directly at Southern California Edison, accusing them of ignoring years of warnings about power line safety. And then, conspiracy theories. One of the most viral claims was the land grab theory. the idea that the fires were deliberately set to clear land for developers. People pointed to suspicious real estate deals and regulatory loopholes, claiming the destruction would make way for luxury developments. But the flames didn't discriminate. They tore through everything, from mansions to small businesses, leaving nothing but ash. Then came the weather weapon theory, insisting that the government intentionally created the disaster for political reasons. Some claimed the fire spread too perfectly to be natural, pointing to anomalies in its behavior. But firefighters and meteorologists dismissed it. Record-breaking winds and extreme drought were enough to turn any spark into a firestorm. And then, the wildest claim of all, space lasers. Conspiracy theorists latched onto images of burned-out neighborhoods, where trees were left standing, calling it proof of a targeted attack. In reality, embers move unpredictably, igniting some structures while skipping others. But that didn't stop thousands of posts from spreading the idea that something far more sinister was at play. And it wasn't over yet, because in the next few hours, firefighters made a shocking discovery. Some fire hydrants were dry. Crews rushed to connect hoses, but there was no water. Entire streets burned with no way to stop it. At the same time, the windstorm grounded air support. Helicopters and tankers couldn't fly, making water drops impossible. And as the flames spread, whole neighborhoods were left to burn. Fire crews were outmatched, and residents had no choice but to flee. The flames were relentless, but the failures that followed were even more devastating. Long before the first spark lit up the dry hills of Los Angeles, the city's fire department was already struggling. In December 2024, just weeks before the inferno,
a wildfire is exploding on the West Coast tonight, consuming everything in its path.
Los Angeles Fire Chief Kristen Crowley issued a warning that many city officials chose to ignore.
Would that $17 million that had been cut from your budget have made a difference in this fight?
I would say with the lean forward posture that we took, knowing that a $17 million cut we had to take from somewhere, and that was from the non-essential duties and responsibilities that as a fire department we have taken on over the past many, many years.
But with all due respect,
the department was facing a $17.6 million budget reduction, a cut that would directly impact the department's ability to prepare for large-scale disasters. She warned that fewer resources meant a weaker response to wildfires, longer wait times, and a department that was simply spread too thin. The consequences of this decision became tragically clear when the fires broke out. On January 7, 2025, at 10:42 a.m., the first 911 calls reported a growing fire in Eaton Canyon. Normally, fire engines should have been dispatched within 5 minutes, but due to staffing shortages and high call volume, it took 15 minutes before the first units were on the way. When the first responders arrived, they were completely outmatched.
Pretty hectic, you got, spotting from house to house, and you think you got control on one, and then
the fire had already moved beyond the initial burn site, jumping from dry brush to trees, from trees to homes. It was no longer just a canyon fire. It was heading straight for neighborhoods. Firefighters knew they needed reinforcements, but help wasn't coming fast enough. Due to ongoing budget constraints, only 2 engine companies were initially deployed, a total of 6 firefighters against a rapidly spreading inferno. Normally, for a fire of this magnitude, at least 10 to 15 units would be called in immediately, supported by aerial drops from firefighting helicopters. But the city had been cutting back on those resources for months, and the effects were now playing out in real time. Residents, unaware of the department's internal struggles, were panicking. Some families barely had time to pack a bag before realizing the flames were already at their doorstep. One woman in Altadena described seeing a wall of fire engulfing her neighbor's house as she grabbed her children and fled. Another man, trapped in gridlocked evacuation traffic, could see the flames in his rearview mirror, growing closer with every passing second. People were desperate, and the firefighters on the scene knew they didn't have enough resources to stop it. As the Eaton fire raged out of control, another emergency call came in from the Pacific Palisades area. A second fire had ignited, spreading with the same terrifying speed. But by this point, the city's emergency response was already fully stretched. There simply weren't enough crews available to fight two simultaneous blazes of this scale. Firefighters at the Palisades site were forced to watch helplessly as the flames spread from the hills toward multi-million-dollar homes along the coast. The fire had gotten ahead of them, and now the only thing left to do was evacuate as many people as possible before it was too late. As exhausted firefighters pushed deeper into burning neighborhoods, they encountered an even bigger disaster. When crews ran to the nearest fire hydrants, connected their hoses, and opened the valves, nothing came out. No water, no pressure, just silence.
What's going on with the water situation?
We have had some issues with water. If you stick enough straws into a glass of water, it's gonna happen.
At first, they thought it was a malfunction. They moved to another hydrant. Same problem. Then another. Then another. Entire streets had no working hydrants. Firefighters on the ground radioed back in frustration. "We have no water. Repeat, no water." This wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of a crippling failure in Los Angeles' water infrastructure.
What are you going to do with the president right now?
We're getting the resources to help rebuild. We're getting the resources.
Why was there no water?
The city's fire suppression system simply wasn't built to handle this level of disaster. Some of the main reservoirs that supply emergency water to hydrants had been shut down for maintenance. And in some areas, the pipes were too old and corroded to handle the sudden high demand. One of the largest water sources, the Santa Ynez Reservoir, had been drained for repairs since early 2024, which left firefighters without access to its 117 million gallons of emergency water. When city engineers were questioned about why it was still offline during wildfire season,
I can only tell you about what happened in Altadena, which also suffered dry hydrants. We are on a hillside.
They admitted that delays in repair funding had left the reservoir non-operational at the worst possible time. The timing couldn't have been worse. As hydrants continued to fail, firefighters desperately looked for alternatives. Some resorted to pulling water from backyard swimming pools, using portable pumps to siphon whatever they could. Others had to watch homes burn to the ground, powerless to stop it. One firefighter later described the horror of realizing entire blocks were doomed simply because they couldn't get a single drop of water onto the flames. For residents, the situation was beyond belief. But the worst was yet to come. Firefighters had one last weapon against the inferno: aerial water drops. In previous wildfires, LA had used firefighting planes and helicopters to slow down the spread, dropping thousands of gallons of water and fire retardant onto the flames. It had worked before. It should have worked this time, but it didn't. The Santa Ana winds were simply too strong. Pilots were ready to go, with planes and helicopters waiting on standby. But when the first aircraft attempted a drop, the water never reached the fire. Instead, it was swept away by 70-mile-per-hour wind gusts, scattering into the sky instead of landing where it was needed. Fire officials were left with an impossible choice. They could send pilots in lower, but the turbulence was so extreme that crash risk became almost certain. One firefighting pilot radioed back to his base. "If we go in, we're not coming out." The orders were given: ground all aircraft. Even one major Super Scooper plane was hit by a drone. This meant that for the entirety of the fire's most destructive hours, Los Angeles had no air support. No water bombers, no helicopters, no last-ditch effort to slow down the flames. It was as if the entire city had been abandoned to burn. By the time aerial support finally resumed, it was too late. The Eaton fire had already destroyed over 10,000 homes, while the Palisades fire had torched entire coastal neighborhoods. One firefighter, sitting on a curb in what used to be a residential street, looked around at the smoking ruins of Los Angeles and muttered the words no one ever expected to hear: "We lost." The morning after the fires, Los Angeles was unrecognizable. Entire blocks were gone. Over 16,000 homes had been destroyed, 29 lives lost, and tens of thousands of residents displaced. And as the city grieved, the anger set in. Why were there no working hydrants? Why weren't the reservoirs filled? And why were firefighters sent into battle underfunded, understaffed, and unprepared? These weren't just rhetorical questions. They demanded answers. And as the lawsuits, investigations, and political firestorm erupted, one thing became painfully clear. This fire could have been stopped, and Los Angeles was never supposed to burn like this. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe for more deep dives like this, and drop a comment. Could this have been prevented, or was it inevitable?